the quiet, wood-paneled galleries of history, there are portraits that hang forever in the shadows, their subjects defined not by the fullness of their lives, but by the stark silhouette of their scandals. They are women mostly, whose stories have been flattened into cautionary tales, their names becoming shorthand for disgrace. Tonight, we are going to walk toward one of the most compelling and maligned of those portraits. The subject is a woman of almost mythical beauty, born to staggering wealth, who married into the highest echelons of the aristocracy. Her name was Margaret, Duchess of Argyll, but history knows her by another crueler name, the Dirty Duchess. It's a label that feels crude, almost cartoonish in its condemnation. Yet for decades it was enough. It was enough to obscure a life of breathtaking complexity, of fierce independence, and of profound tragedy. It was enough to bury the story of a woman who was a product of a glittering, ruthless era, who was betrayed in the most intimate way imaginable, and who was publicly sacrificed on the altar of a hypocritical morality. To understand her, we must look beyond the caricature. We must step back in time into the very world that both created and destroyed her, a world of dazzling privilege and unforgiving judgment. This is not just the story of a scandal, it is the story of a life in all its glorious and heartbreaking detail. To truly grasp the trajectory of Margaret Whigham's life, we must first immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of her birth and youth. Born in 1912, she was a child of the final opulent moments of the Edwardian age, a world still governed by rigid social certainties. But the cataclysm of the First World War would irrevocably shatter that world, leaving behind a generation haunted by loss. Margaret came of age in its aftermath during the frenetic, champagne-soaked rebellion of the Roaring Twenties. This was the era of jazz and cocktails, of shedding corsets for shorter hemlines, a time when the survivors of the Great War adopted a frantic live-for-today mentality. It was the age of the bright young things, a generation of wealthy, aristocratic youth who, having witnessed the fragility of life, were determined to live with a desperate, almost nihilistic hedonism. They hosted elaborate fancy dress parties that lasted for days, engaged in wild treasure hunts through London's West End, and documented their every exploit in the glossy pages of society magazines like Tatler and The Sketch. This glittering, chaotic stage was the perfect setting for a star like Margaret to be born. This was the birth of modern celebrity culture, and Margaret was perfectly cast to be its star. She wasn't an aristocrat by birth, which in some ways made her even more intriguing to a public tired of the old guard. She was the sole heiress to an immense modern fortune, representing the power and glamour of the New World. Her father, George Whigham, was a formidable figure, a shrewd, self-made Scottish industrialist who had climbed to the chairmanship of the Celanese Corporation of America. His wealth, built not on ancestral land, but on the cutting-edge technology of synthetic fibers, on rayon and acetate, could rival that of any duke. He understood that his money could buy access, but Margaret's marriage could secure a dynasty. He meticulously groomed her for this role, providing a life of almost unimaginable luxury, a magnificent townhouse on London's prestigious Upper Grosvenor Street, a sprawling country estate, and pied-à-terre in New York and Paris. She was fluent in French, a gifted horsewoman, and possessed a poise that money alone could not buy, a self-assurance that both fascinated and intimidated the established aristocracy. Her beauty was, by all accounts, extraordinary. It wasn't just prettiness, it was a potent, high-glamour beauty that seemed made for the camera's lens, a quality that set her apart in a sea of debutantes. With her flawless complexion, dark, dramatic hair, and startlingly intelligent blue eyes, she commanded attention the moment she entered a room. but her true power lay in her innate sense of style. She understood the architecture of clothing, the power of a perfectly cut silhouette, treating fashion not just as adornment, but as armor. Long before the term was coined, she was a fashion icon. In 1930, her official debut into society was not just a success, it was a phenomenon. She was unanimously declared the Debutante of the Year, a title that cemented her status as the most desirable and talked about young woman in the English-speaking world, what she wore, where she dined, and with whom she danced became the subject of endless column inches. She was courted by princes, film stars, and magnates, men who ran empires and kingdoms, from the incredibly wealthy Prince Ali Khan to the reclusive aviation tycoon Howard Hughes. She was the ultimate prize in the intricate, high-stakes marriage market of the upper classes. A woman who seemed to hold all the cards, captivating powerful men who were accustomed to getting anything they wanted. Yet beneath this polished veneer of the perfect debutante, there was a current of willfulness and a desire for a life less choreographed. This independent streak led to her passionate, clandestine romance with a charismatic up-and-coming actor named David Niven, a thrilling act of rebellion against her gilded cage. In the rigid social structure of the time, an actor was not considered a suitable match for an heiress of her stature, making their secret meetings all the more perilous and exciting. Their affair was intense, but it led to a crisis that threatened to bring her glittering world crashing down. At 17, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. In the 1920s, this was a catastrophe beyond measure. An illegitimate child would mean absolute social ruin, a permanent stain that would render her unmarriageable and cast her out as a pariah. The only solution was a secret, illegal abortion. Her father's immense wealth and influence were deployed to handle the problem with grim efficiency. Margaret was quietly sent away for the dangerous back alley procedure, facing the risk of infection, infertility, or even death. We can only speculate on the psychological trauma of this event, the fear, the isolation, the enforced silence. It was a brutal initiation into the harsh realities that lay beneath the surface of her gilded life, a profound lesson in the importance of keeping secrets and living a double life. In 1933, having learned her lesson, Margaret made the match that society had been waiting for. She married Charles Sweeney, a handsome, charming, and wealthy American amateur golfer and stockbroker, a man who was in every way a safe and spectacularly suitable choice. Their wedding was the social event of the decade, a public spectacle that rivaled a royal occasion. The crowds outside the Brompton Oratory were so immense, an estimated 20,000 people, that they completely blocked the London traffic. A sea of faces desperate for a glimpse of the famous heiress finally fulfilling her destiny. The press reported on every detail, but none more so than her dress. Designed by Norman Hartnell, the couturier who would later create Queen Elizabeth II's wedding and coronation gowns, it was a vision of shimmering silk satin with a breathtaking 30-foot train and delicate pearl embroidery. The gown was more than just a dress, it was a statement of power and taste that was copied around the globe, cementing her status as a global style icon. For over a decade, Margaret Sweeney seemed to live a charmed life. She had 2 children, a daughter, Frances, and a son, Brian. A third child tragically died in infancy. She divided her time between London and New York, holding court on glamorous ocean liners and reigning as the undisputed queen of transatlantic high society. But the role of the conventional wife and mother seemed to be an ill fit for her restless and attention-seeking nature, which craved the constant validation of the public eye. Charles was often absorbed in his business affairs, and Margaret, left to her own devices, thrived on a diet of parties, admiration, and excitement that her husband could not provide. Whispers of her flirtations and his absences began to circulate. Cracks began to appear in the perfect facade of their marriage, and the emotional distance between them grew, even as they maintained a united front for the press. Finally, the public pretense became impossible to sustain, and in 1947 they divorced, an event that shocked a public who had only ever seen the fairy tale. During this period, a pivotal and catastrophic event occurred, one that many biographers, and even Margaret herself, believe fundamentally altered the course of her life. In 1943, during the London Blitz, Margaret was visiting her foot doctor in a building on Bond Street. As she stepped into the elevator, the car wasn't there. She plunged nearly 40 feet down the open shaft, landing brutally on the basement floor. Her injuries were horrific. She suffered multiple fractures, including a severe fracture to her skull. For days, she hovered between life and death. She survived, but the accident left indelible scars, both seen and unseen. She permanently lost her sense of taste and smell. More profoundly, many who knew her well claimed that the brain injury she sustained changed her personality. She became, they said, more impulsive, more emotionally volatile, and, it was widely rumored, developed an insatiable sexual appetite. While this narrative is complex and risks pathologizing her sexuality, modern neurology recognizes that severe trauma to the frontal lobe can indeed result in profound personality changes, including disinhibition and hypersexuality. This tragic accident adds a crucial layer of context to her later life, suggesting that the woman who would be so viciously condemned for her desires may have been grappling with the unseen neurological consequences of a near-fatal awl. After her divorce, Margaret was a single, wealthy, and still beautiful woman in her mid-30s. In 1951, she met Ian Douglas Campbell, the 11th Duke of Argyll. He was the possessor of one of the great ducal titles of Scotland, chieftain of the mighty Clan Campbell, and master of Inverary, a spectacular neo-Gothic castle on the shores of Loch Fyne. To Margaret, who had wealth but not lineage, the allure was irresistible. Marrying Ian would grant her the ultimate social prize. She would become her grace, the Duchess of Argyll. But Ian Campbell was a man walking on a precipice of self-destruction. His aristocratic charm and war hero status, he had been a POW in Germany, masked a deeply troubled soul. He was a violent alcoholic, a compulsive gambler who had squandered much of his family's remaining fortune and was heavily addicted to prescription medications, particularly a potent amphetamine barbiturate mix known as Drinamil, or Purple Hearts. He had already been married and divorced twice, leaving a trail of emotional and financial wreckage. He saw in Margaret not a partner, but a lifeline. Her fortune was the key to paying off his colossal debts, and most importantly, to restoring the crumbling grandeur of Inverary Castle. Their marriage was from the outset a toxic fusion of her money and ambition, and his title and desperation. Margaret poured her inheritance into the castle, meticulously overseeing its restoration and redecoration, transforming it into a magnificent showplace. She played the role of the Duchess to perfection, hosting grand parties and embracing her new status. But the private reality of their life was a nightmare. The Duke's moods, fueled by alcohol and pills, were terrifyingly volatile. He subjected her to verbal abuse and, according to her, physical violence. His paranoia, a common side effect of his amphetamine use, spiraled into a pathological obsession with her fidelity. He bugged her car, steamed open her letters, and had her followed by private detectives. The fairy tale castle had become her prison. The marriage disintegrated into a state of open warfare. By the late 1950s, they were living largely separate lives, their relationship a hollow sham. It was then that the Duke, driven by his obsessive jealousy and a desperate need to control the narrative of their separation, made his fateful move. While Margaret was in New York, he orchestrated a break-in of her private rooms at their Mayfair house. With a locksmith in tow, he forced open a locked Louis Vuitton secrétaire, a piece of furniture that held her most personal belongings. Inside, he found what he was looking for: her diaries, filled with candid entries about her social life and a cache of private photographs. This act of calculated violation was not just a prelude to a divorce. It was the gathering of ammunition for an execution. The ensuing court case in 1963 was not a divorce. It was a character assassination, meticulously staged for a ravenous public. Argyll versus Argyll became the divorce of the century. The Duke's legal strategy was one of overwhelming humiliation. He didn't just accuse Margaret of a single affair. He presented the court with a now infamous list of 88 men he alleged were her lovers. This list was a work of scandalous fiction and conjecture, mixing men she genuinely knew with names seemingly plucked from her address book. It was rumored to include 2 government ministers and members of the royal family. The goal was not to prove each allegation, but to create an impression of insatiable, almost pathological promiscuity. But the cornerstone of his case was the stolen evidence. Her diaries were read aloud, their entries twisted and interpreted in the most sordid fashion. Yet it was the Polaroid pictures that caused the true sensation. In an age before digital media, the instant nature of a Polaroid photograph felt incredibly intimate and private. To have such images displayed in a court of law was unprecedentedly shocking. The most notorious of these images showed the Duchess, identifiable by her setting, and most famously, her signature 3-strand pearl necklace, performing fellatio on a man whose head and face were deliberately excluded from the frame. The image of the Headless Man became a national obsession, a symbol of aristocratic decadence and moral decay. The identity of the man became the subject of a frenzied nationwide guessing game. Speculation centered on 2 main figures. The first was Duncan Sandys, the Minister of Defense and Winston Churchill's son-in-law. An affair between a senior government minister and the Duchess could have triggered a massive political scandal, especially during the height of the Cold War. The second was the debonair Hollywood star Douglas Fairbanks Jr., a longtime friend of Margaret's. The Duke's legal team even brought in handwriting experts to compare the captions on some photos to samples from the suspects. Margaret, for the rest of her life, refused to name the man. It was her one final act of defiance, a steadfast adherence to a personal code of honor, even as her own had been so completely violated. The trial was a spectacle of institutional misogyny. The Duke's own rampant infidelity, his addictions, his violence, all were treated as secondary issues, the understandable reactions of a cuckolded husband. Margaret's sexuality, however, was placed center stage and judged with a puritanical ferocity. She was the temptress, the adulteress, the source of the rot. The final judgment, delivered by Lord Wheatley, stands as one of the most savage judicial condemnations of a woman in modern British legal history. Dispensing with any pretense of dispassionate legal reasoning, he launched into a moralistic tirade. He famously described Margaret as a completely promiscuous woman and a highly sexed woman who had ceased to be satisfied with normal relations and had started to indulge in what can only be described as disgusting sexual activities. He publicly shamed her, using the authority of the court to validate the most extreme and hateful narratives being pushed by her husband and the press. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The divorce was granted. But Margaret lost more than just her marriage. She lost her reputation, her social standing, and a vast portion of her fortune in legal fees. The press, which had once fawned over her as the debutante of the year, now gleefully branded her with the permanent poisonous moniker, the Dirty Duchess. It was a devastatingly effective piece of character assassination, reducing a complex, intelligent, and spirited woman to a two-word sneer. Her ordeal was a chilling precursor to the modern phenomenon of revenge porn, a stark demonstration of how a woman's sexuality can be weaponized to destroy her public and private life. The decades that followed the trial were a long, slow fade from grace. Margaret was cast out from the high society that had been her entire world. She became a social pariah, a living embodiment of scandal. Yet she refused to disappear quietly. She continued to live in her Mayfair house, a defiant symbol of her past life, hosting parties for a dwindling circle of loyal friends. But her finances were in ruins. She tried to earn money by writing a sanitized, discreet memoir called Forget Not, and, in a move that horrified the establishment, by opening her home for paid public tours. As the years passed, the debts became insurmountable. She was forced to sell the house and all its contents. She moved into a suite at the Grosvenor House Hotel, a ghost of her former glamorous self. When the money ran out for that, her final years were spent in a nursing home in Pimlico. The woman who had worn custom Norman Hartnell gowns and dazzled princes died in relative obscurity in 1993 at the age of 80. The headlines that announced her death were predictable, all of them leading with a scandal that had defined the last 30 years of her life. To look back on the life of Margaret, Duchess of Argyll, is to confront a story that is as infuriating as it is tragic. Was she a victim? Unquestionably. She was the victim of a vindictive, abusive husband, a misogynistic legal system, and a predatory press. She was a victim of a society that applied a vicious double standard, punishing female sexuality while excusing male transgression. Her privacy was violated in a manner that is shocking even by today's standards. But to see her only as a victim is to diminish her. She was also a woman of incredible resilience and defiant spirit. She lived her life, for better or worse, on her own terms. In an era that demanded female subservience, she was unapologetically independent. She embraced her desires in a way that was decades ahead of her time, and she paid an almost unimaginable price for that freedom. Her story has been re-examined in recent years, most notably in the television series A Very British Scandal, which sought to reclaim her narrative and portray her with the empathy and complexity she was denied in her lifetime. Margaret's portrait in the gallery of history is no longer entirely in shadow. We can now see the finer details, the brilliant debutante, the stylish icon, the determined survivor, the woman who endured a near-fatal accident, the victim of a terrible betrayal. She was not the Dirty Duchess. She was Margaret Campbell, a woman of fire and fragility who flew too close to the sun of public adoration and was burned, not by her own flame, but by the cold, calculated cruelty of others. Her story is a timeless and necessary reminder of the human cost of public shaming and of the enduring power of a woman who, in the face of utter ruin, simply refused to be erased.